Welcome to the first of Linnell's Soapbox Issues. When I taught college classes, every once in a while a topic would come up that would activate an incoming rant, and I would notify the class that this is one of my soapbox issues. And then they knew that whatever came next was not likely to end up on the exam. However, it was something I felt strongly about, and so that rant was coming and it might be entertaining. And I want to share some of those soapbox issues with you. The first of them is actually an extension of the third episode of the Theological Lens, where I shared a perspective on where our emotions come from, that our emotions emanate from our thoughts and from our actions. And this one, I want to talk a little bit about emotional tyranny and what happens when we determine that our emotions came from someone else. So, to give you some context, I was raised by mean parents. And in retrospect, when I look back at my childhood, it almost seems like my parents didn't care at all about my emotional experience. Because when I was upset about something and I came racing into the room to complain about one of my sisters, I might say something like, "She made me so mad," or "She hurt my feelings." And when I did that, my parents didn't lean into what on earth, they needed to do to settle down my emotions. Instead, they reminded me of my own agency in the situation. They said, "Nobody can make you feel anything," because they recognized that between what had happened and my response to what had happened were a whole bunch of different variables that were entirely under my own control. Now, I had bought into, even apparently as a child, a theory that came out of behaviorism. And that theory is known as the SR theory, or the stimulus response theory. And that says there's a stimulus that takes place, and then there is a response that comes directly as a result of that stimulus. But even by 1974, Morabian and Russell had proposed that the SR theory was missing an important piece. And they proposed the SOR theory, or the stimulus organism response theory. And they said between that stimulus and that response are a whole bunch of intrinsic variables that come from the organism. And those variables are going to moderate, they're going to affect what happens between the stimulus and the response. It'll change the response based on things that come directly from the organism and not directly from the stimulus. In order to flesh this out a little bit, I want to use an illustration that might be helpful. Many years ago, I found out that somebody had called me a very mean name that rhymes with witch. And when I discovered that, now I have to figure out how to respond to that. How should I feel about the fact that somebody had referred to me in that kind of way? And I think there's like three different layers, at least, of variables that are under my control, of assumptions, of presuppositions that I have to work through to come to what my response is going to be to that situation. So the first of those is, what caused the individual to call me that? Like, were they having a bad day? Were they upset were they just intimidated by my awesomeness? Because that's probably it. Were they jealous? Whatever my conclusions are about what motivated them, that's going to change how I respond to it. Now, notably, when we study these motivational conclusions that we draw in the world of social psychology, it's called attribution theory. And what we have learned about how human beings assume the motivations of others is that we are terrible at it. We're generally way off base in assuming why others do the things that they do. In fact, there's a very well-known fundamental attribution error that says we are much more likely to assume that other people do negative things because of their weak character, and that we do negative things because of our circumstances. We cut ourselves a little slack, but assume the worst in other people. We're really bad at assuming those motivations, but how we assume those motivations will affect how we respond to any given stimulus situation. So the second thing that I have to determine is, what does that even mean to be called that? And that's about my perceptions of that word, because there are people who take that word that starts with a B and rhymes with witch, and they own it. They said that, yes, this is a label I claim, because to them it means that they're strong and they're awesome, and they don't take any garbage from anybody, and they see that as a net positive. So Whether or not I see this as something that I go, yeah, I want to wear that as a badge of honor, or I see it as something that makes me cry in the corner, is up to me. It's not up to the person who actually threw that word out. So the first is, what is the individual's motivation? The second is, what does it actually mean? And then the third variable that is going to moderate how I respond is, how much power do I give to the other individual? Because that's under our control. We get to decide who we hand authority to in our life, who we allow to speak deeply into our hearts, and who we ignore and treat as irrelevant. And I've sometimes used the illustration of a soundboard to explain this. If you've ever been in a venue where they're trying to project and balance different sound inputs, you know that in the sound booth, there is a board that has a whole bunch of dials and knobs and buttons. And these dials and knobs and buttons are used by the individual who's managing that sound to balance out the contributions that are coming in. If you think about this from a church service, a lot of churches might have a team of people on the platform that are leading music. They are the praise team. And among those people, there are varying levels of musical strength. In fact, I sometimes joke that it seems like a lot of praise teams have somebody on them that should be in the nursery. Maybe this isn't the spiritual gift that they were hoping that it was going to be. Maybe they're not as strong musically as they think they are. While the people who are working in the sound booth are assessing the different inputs, and they are determining whose slider volume should be increased, whose should be decreased, and maybe there's somebody up there who should be muted altogether. I was at a church service where a guitarist forgot to put on their capo, and they played the entire song in the wrong key. Well, the soundboard individual has to mute that so that it doesn't disrupt the rest of what's going out. We have that kind of power in our lives. We can decide who we're handing the microphone to, and we can decide how much volume we give to that microphone, how much we are going to allow them to affect our hearts. Maybe there's somebody who gives you criticism, but it's constructive criticism. They want to strengthen you, they want you to grow. Turn up that volume. Maybe there's somebody in your life who is just in a cranky mood and letting nasty things fly. Bring down that volume. If there's somebody who is constantly pushing you away from the things of God, hit that mute button. We have the control to do that. We can decide. We don't have to let people who are going to let their hurt affect other people, we don't have to let them ruin our day. We can change the amount of volume we let it to speak into our own hearts. And so these three things I think are really critical. But what's happening in our culture is pushing away from healthiness in this, because we've gotten into something in our culture that kind of suggests that by very nature of being offended, I'm thus right. And by the fact that I'm offended, it means that whoever caused it is wrong, because I've decided they're wrong because I was upset. And it's creating a little bit of an oppression Olympics. If I can claim offense, now I have the moral authority, and you are belittled just because you somehow caused the offense, or I blame you for causing the offense. Many years ago, I had the opportunity to travel to South Africa. It was a wonderful experience. But as I took some students for a study abroad opportunity, I was cognizant of the fact that sometimes ignorant Americans are very offensive as they travel overseas and they do things that are just not cool. And so I consulted on a semi-regular basis with another colleague who was based in South Africa about what were things that we could say or do that would potentially be offensive, and how do we make sure that we moderate that and be wise. And before we headed out to the straw market one day, I turned to him and I said, "Oh, I now have questions about cultural appropriation." And he asked for some clarification about what my concerns were. And I said, back in the US, it's very easy to offend others when a white person seems to be enjoying or using something that's culturally linked to a different culture that is not their own. And I said, if we're going to go to the straw market and they're selling African clothing, would it be offensive if a white person bought that African clothing and wore that African clothing? And he said, well, why don't you ask ask them. So as we went around the straw market, I asked a couple different vendors what their perspective on that would be. Now, it's fair to note that those vendors were making their living selling these items. So they were very motivated to want people to buy them. But that apparently included white people because as I talked to one woman and I said, is this a bad thing if a white person were to buy this and wear this? What would you think? And she said, well, she would feel beautiful. You would feel beautiful. You should buy this. This is great clothing. This is a great way to dress. And she seemed to find it not offensive. However, I still had concerns that if one of my girls brought something back to the States, one of those students bought something and then wore it in the States, that might be people here who would perceive it offensive when the actual African who sold it to them did not. And the reason for that is we've gotten some things a little bit twisted where it doesn't matter what the motivation of the wearer is. It just matters that somebody is upset about it. And thus, the person who's upset is right, and the person who caused the upset is by very nature wrong. And it wouldn't matter how much the person tried to be sensitive and wanted to show cultural appreciation, not appropriation. That wouldn't matter because somebody's offended, and thus everything is clearly they're clearly right if they're offended. And this comes up sometimes at Halloween because little girls and boys are told what costumes they're not allowed to wear at Halloween, especially if they're white. Moana was a very, very popular movie, and there were a lot of little girls that wanted to dress like their heroine, Moana, for Halloween. And people were told, no, that is cultural appropriation. That is offensive. That's just showing white privilege. Well, maybe Pacific Islanders don't find it that way, or maybe some do and others don't. And the motivation for that little girl doesn't matter. All that matters is that somebody's mad about it. Like we've then forgotten that between the stimulus and the response are variables related to the organism. And those variables are things that we can control. We can decide how much power that they are going to affect into our lives. And for me, I find this to actually be encouraging because I don't have to live in a perpetual state of upset. I don't have to let thoughtless individuals or an individual who's having a bad day or an individual who had no idea what they said might affect. I don't have to let them ruin my day. I don't have to give them that kind of power. And this is something that I think is so, so important for us to recognize our own agency in developing our not just emotional responses, but our actual behavioral responses. We can't blame it on other people. We have to recognize that we have the power to guide our own responses to those situations. And unfortunately, those messages are skipped in a lot of areas in our current culture. Instead, just find somebody to blame it on and then you're the one who's right and they're the one that's wrong. And maybe what we really need in 2025 is some mean parents.
If you enjoyed what you just heard, we invite you to like the episode and, if possible, leave a positive review. If you know someone who could benefit from this content, please share it on your social media. We also ask that you subscribe and follow so that you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. We are so glad that you chose to be with us today. We hope that you will join us again next week on The Theological Lens.